Okay, hello everyone. I will take this in English because of that Ken can understand what we are saying. And today we are two hosts from Drammen Hundesenter who will accompany you during the webinar. It is my colleague and instructor in the team, Anne-Mette, and myself, Gro. And Anne-Mette will also join us during the recording we will do afterwards when we do a podcast with Ken Ramirez.
We don't know quite where to start to give Ken Ramirez a fair and proper introduction. But with over 40 years of experience and with an enormous competence that is impossible to beat, we just would like to say briefly that Ken is the Executive Vice President and Chief Training Officer of Karen Prior Clicker Training. And then we will leave to Ken to introduce himself and tell more about his background. But we would like to mention very shortly one particular thing that has really impressed us, and that is a unique butterfly project where he trained 10,000 butterflies. And this is something he will tell us more about when he comes to Norway in October.
Mm-hmm. And for the next 30 minutes, we'll turn the screen over to Ken Ramirez. We have chosen to give an insight into one of the topics that will be on the program in October, and Ken will soon tell us what today's topic is. You can ask questions in the chat or use Messenger on Facebook. Then you use my personal profile. It is public and open to everyone, so you're welcome to put your questions in Messenger. Feel free to ask the question in Norwegian. If we can make it, Ken will answer questions right at the end. So we are now ready to welcome Ken Ramirez. Enjoy the next half hour.
Thank you very, very much, Gro and Anne-Mette. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate all of you being with me today. I know that you found out about this webinar on short notice, but we did want to talk to you a little bit about the seminar that I will be doing in Norway. I am looking forward to my trip to Norway. I have never been to Norway, and I will be coming to you in October, which is just a few short months away. I tend to teach professional trainers most of the time, but many of the people that come to my seminars are also just good training enthusiasts who have a real passion for training and passion for teaching animals. And one of the topics that I will be talking about when I come to Norway is talking about complex tools. Oftentimes as trainers, we hear about tools that our colleagues are using, whether it's a keep going signal or a jackpot or an end of session signal. And we often have a lot of controversy around those topics. And so what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to share my screen with you now as I talk about some of these topics, and I'll take questions if you have any at the end. I'm going to talk about the idea of simplifying complex training tools. So often as trainers, we hear about these very complicated tools, but we have difficulty finding good information about them. We can't find them in the literature, or different trainers talk about the tools in different ways. And so one of my goals when I am there in October is to try to look at each tool individually. And as we look at each of the tools, what I hope to do is first define what a complex training tool is. I will explain it and try to define it for you when I come to Norway. Then what I'll do is I'll look at what the science says about a tool. What has the scientific literature said about that particular tool? And then I'll spend some time talking about practical application of the tools. How do different trainers use the tools? And then my goal is to give you enough information that you can then decide if you should use the tool. Oftentimes people are uncertain, is this particular tool something I should use with my dogs or with my horse or with the animals that I work with? I always look at a discussion about training tools very much like a toolbox. And as a professional trainer, I believe it's important to have all of the tools in the toolbox, even if I don't use them very often. I think it's important that I understand how to use them, that I understand why some people use them, and that I understand why other people don't use them. So when we come to Norway, what I'm going to do is I will, for one section of the days of the many days that I am there, I will talk about complex tools. And I'll spend time talking about things like the keep going signal, jackpots, no reinforcement markers, timeouts, the least reinforcing scenario, redirection strategies, recalls, behavior chains, and end of session signals. And these are just the controversial tools. I will talk about many other things when I come to Norway, but this will take up a good part of one afternoon where we'll talk about each of these tools individually. So I thought this evening, today, I would talk about end of session signals. Generally speaking, an end of session signal is defined as a signal that tells your animal that the session is over, that there is no more reinforcement, that the animal is free to go do its own thing. That's what people usually mean when they call something an end of session signal. Some people have a word, some people do something with their hands. Everybody's a little bit different, but many trainers use something called an end of session signal. What's interesting is for almost 50 years now, I have been training. And I go to many, many, many professional training conferences, dog training conferences, zoo training conferences, horse training conferences. I go to many conferences. And of all the different animals that I work with, the tool that I would say is the most controversial is often the end of session signal. There's a great debate about its use, even among very skilled trainers. Even among trainers who are very knowledgeable, who are excellent trainers, some will say it is an essential and helpful tool. Every trainer should use an end of session signal. Yet there are other trainers who say, oh no. Others claim it's unnecessary and ultimately it's harmful. You should never use an end of session signal. Why the disparity? Why is there so much debate? Why is there so much controversy over something as simple as an end of session signal? Well, let me share with you the way various people look at it. First, I'll tell you why people who don't like the end of session signal don't like it. Then I'll tell you why people who do use an end of session signal think it's so important. So let's talk about the people who are against the end of session signal. Many times, trainers who don't like an end of session signal say isn't an end of session signal a cue that indicates to your animal that you're going to take away their reinforcement? And if you're going to take away their reinforcement, isn't that the definition of a timeout? A timeout is the removal of an opportunity for reinforcement. A timeout is a punisher. Thus, it's aversive. So for many trainers, they say, I don't want to tell my animal session is over. I don't want them to feel like they're being punished. Another reason that a lot of people don't use it is in the zoo world. When you work with large animals in free contact, it can be dangerous. If you are working inside the enclosure with a large animal like an elephant or a dangerous animal like a tiger, and you say to your animal, all done now, but the animal doesn't want to be done, it can be a very dangerous thing. That animal might try to prevent you from leaving the exhibit. They may try to keep you from exiting. They don't want the session to be over. So an end of session signal in that scenario can be very, very dangerous. And for other people, they will suggest that if you're working with a large group of social animals, when you use an end of session signal, it cues them that they can interact with each other. And often animals that are low in the hierarchy can associate aggression from dominant animals as being a cue from the trainer. And so for that reason, many people want to avoid it. Let me show you a video. In this next video, this is at a zoo, at an aquarium that I used to work at. And we used to work inside the enclosure with these large 300, 400 kilo animals. This is a large sea lion. And you're going to see in this video that even though we didn't use an end of session signal, the animals could predict when the session was over. And they would try to keep us from leaving the exhibit, which is one of the reasons some people don't like an end of session signal. But let me just let you watch this video first.
This is a partial view of our sea lion exhibit, where we happen to house animals recently rescued from the wild. At this early stage, less experienced trainers feed and train through special windows we designed in the rocky backdrop. However, our more experienced staff will go into the exhibit for some training. This male California sea lion weighs over 700 pounds, and even though he has only been with our program for a few short months, his training is going very well. When working with animals in a free contact setting, we avoid teaching any type of end of session signal. If we are successful at making training fun, we don't want a signal telling the animal that the fun is suddenly over. When a 700-pound animal doesn't want you to leave, that can be dangerous. In just a moment, the trainer will try to pass the sea lion to another trainer at the window, something that is often done toward the end of a session. The sea lion, presumably not wanting the session to end, refuses to transfer and actually pushes forward at the trainer, a very dangerous situation. Even though we avoid training an end of session signal, animals easily pick up on cues that inadvertently let them know that a session is almost over. After several tries, the trainer decides to ask the sea lion to swim, which he also refuses by laying down and blocking her exit. She decides to lure him into the water with fish, which allows her to make a safe alternative exit. To avoid this type of inadvertent cueing, we now use many different types of exiting strategies so as not to be predictable. Even when using the window transfer technique, we make sure that it is well reinforced and not indicative of the session coming to an end.
Target, good.
In fact, transferring to the window can often be the start of another lengthy training segment. Our goal is not to create an end of session signal, inadvertently or on purpose, so that we can continue to interact with our animals in a safe manner.
So hopefully that gave you an understanding of why some trainers are against the end of session signal. We don't want the animal to know that the session is over so that the trainer can leave safely. It can create a very dangerous working situation. However, there are other trainers who are very much in favor of an end of session signal. They like the fact that it lets the animal know that they're done working and they can go do their own thing. Often, trainers who like the end of session signal suggest that it reduces anxiousness from animals that are eager to please. They're so attentive to you that it's helpful for them to understand and know when a session is no longer in place. One of the places where I've used an end of session signal, like when I work in a zoo, I often don't use an end of session signal like I just showed you. But I got my start working with guide dogs. And when we work with guide dogs or service dogs, sometimes you need a signal that lets the animal know that you're not going to be working with them for a little while. When we would work with our guide dog, when a guide dog would take its handler to a restaurant to eat dinner, once the handler was seated at the table, he could look at his dog and say, "At ease," or "Take a rest now," or "Take a break," and the dog would curl up under the table and go to sleep. That end of session cue didn't mean go out in the street and play, but it did mean you don't have to pay attention to me. You can go to sleep for a little while. I'll tell you when I'm ready to start again. And that was a very important signal that trainers of guide dogs, service dogs, needed to be able to use. It, in a sense, said, you are at rest now. You can take a break now. You don't have to keep your attention focused on me. We'll return to working a little bit later on. Many trainers use an end of session signal. Many trainers find it a very helpful training tool. Let me show you this. This is another video that I want to show you. This is from a zoo as well, but this is one in which they use an end of session signal. And I want you to watch the way they use it. Now, this is another very large and dangerous animal. It is a walrus. And here you can see the trainer is working with the walrus in the water. Before he ends his session, you'll notice over to the left, his colleagues are preparing enrichment for the walrus. They put a lot of mussels and clams under the ice, and they did that during the training session. That way, when the trainer is done, he says, all done. He gives his end of session cue, and then the walrus goes and looks for the enrichment. And in a sense, excuse me, in a sense, for this walrus, that end of session cue actually meant the start of an enrichment session. Yes, formal training is now over, but now it's time for you to play. Now it's time for you to forage. Now it's time for your enrichment session. So although it may be thought of as an end of session signal, in many cases, this was really a signal that said, end of formal training, but start of playtime. Here is something else that you can do. And so many trainers would say that's not really an end of session signal. It's really a start of a new kind of session. Let me tell you what the science tells us about an end of session signal, and let me give you my own opinion about it before I run out of time. 30 minutes goes by very quickly, doesn't it? End of session signals are not really a part of the scientific literature. The term end of session signal is something that we as trainers came up with to sort of explain how we finish our training session. But because there is no such thing in the science, every single person who uses an end of session signal uses it differently. Not everybody uses it the same way. Sometimes when people say, I use an end of session signal, instead of jumping to a conclusion and saying, oh, that's good or that's bad, what I usually do is go, oh, that's interesting. Tell me how you use it. What does it mean to your animal? What do they do after you use it? That way I have an understanding of what they mean when they say an end of session signal. I have spoken to thousands of trainers, many of whom use an end of session signal, but every single person I talk to uses it differently. So rather than assume when someone says I use an end of session signal, I don't assume what they do. I always ask them, tell me what that looks like. Tell me how it works for you. Tell me why you use it. That way I have a better understanding of what they mean by an end of session signal. What I will say is the use of an end of session signal or the lack of use of an end of session signal does not make or break a training program. There are excellent trainers who use it, and there are excellent trainers who don't use it. I think the decision about whether to use an end of session signal should be based on the way your animal reacts to it, which is something you can easily observe. When someone asks me, should I use an end of session signal? I often say, tell me what happens when you use an end of session signal. If when your session is over, your animal goes off and plays or goes off and lays down and seems very happy and comfortable, then there's probably nothing wrong with your end of session signal. On the other hand, if you use an end of session signal and your animals start fighting, or your animal becomes anxious, or your animal seems worried, well, then I might change what I do because it appears that your animal is responding poorly. In the end, that's the ultimate question. How does your animal respond to it? If you like the way they respond, keep doing it. If you don't like the way they respond, stop doing it. That's how I often answer most questions about most tools. Are you happy with the results? If you're not happy, you need to change something. If you're happy, then keep doing it. Animals will eventually know when a training session is over. Do you actually need to cue it? Maybe, but maybe not. I remember many years ago, people would ask about this in conferences all the time. And I always tried to explain to them that an end of session signal, or the lack of use of an end of session signal, is not indicative of good or bad training. Good trainers use it. Good trainers don't use it. Bad trainers use it. Bad trainers don't use it. It's really a question about how well it works for you. So several years ago, I was always a regular attendee at this very big zoological conference. And trainers always were arguing about whether you should use an end of session signal or not. And they always ended up asking me my opinion. So one year I put this video together that I want to show you. And I meant this video to sort of be sarcastic a little bit, a little tongue in cheek. I was hoping it would be humorous. I think at the time, people were so upset about the use of an end of session signal that they didn't find this video very funny. But I'm going to show it to you now because maybe you will find it humorous and you will understand that the question, it's a great question, but it shouldn't be the thing that causes us to argue all the time. And so this is the video that I shared with my colleagues at the conference. Sorry, here it is.
There are those who would suggest that a lack of an end of session signal causes your animal to stay focused on you, waiting for you to re-engage and continue with the session. The purpose of an end of session signal is to make sure your animal doesn't get confused or frustrated, following you everywhere you go, thinking that the session is not over. Now, I don't normally use an end of session signal, but perhaps I'm not being observant. It is possible that my pets are showing me signs that an end of session signal would be helpful, and I just haven't noticed. I plan to keep an open mind and see if there are any signs that I may be missing. In reality, whether you use an end of session signal or not, your animals will eventually figure out that a session has ended.
And so that was meant to be a humorous look at the end of session signal. I will end this talk today by saying, I think there are good reasons to use an end of session signal for some situations, and there are good reasons not to use an end of session signal in other situations. It's unique, it's individual, but you can't look to the science because the science doesn't have something called an end of session signal. It's something that we as practical trainers have implemented into our program. I want to thank you for listening to me talk about the end of session signal. We don't have a lot of time, so I wanted to keep it short, but I want to remind you that if you have questions or you want to learn more or want to have a more in-depth discussion about controversial tools, come to my seminar that I'll be doing in Norway in October. And before I say goodbye, I will quit sharing my screen in just a minute, and I will look and see if you have any questions. I will look at the chat window and answer questions. I'll keep this up on the screen so you can see my Instagram account, my Twitter account, my email address. And I look forward, I hope to see all of you in person in Norway in October. So having said all of that, let me see if there are any questions that people have. I see that Marianne said, I use an end of session signal and I still laughed at the video. Well, I'm glad. My purpose for the video was to be humorous and to make people realize not to take everything so seriously. I think end of session signals are a great tool under many conditions, but they're an unnecessary tool in other conditions. And we as trainers have to look at each situation individually to determine what makes the most sense for our animals. I see that Margit says, great to hear how things are functional or not, depending upon the situation. Thank you for your time and shared experience. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And I appreciate everybody's interest in these various topics. happy to answer any other questions. We still have 3 or 4 minutes. Often we will, when I do a seminar in person, there's lots of great opportunities to ask questions as well. One of the things that we are setting up for when I do come to Norway in October is we're going to talk about a lot of topics, not just complex tools. We'll talk about aggression treatment. We'll talk about problem solving. We'll talk about medical training and various reinforcement strategies. So we have lots of fun topics to talk about. I'm very much looking forward to coming to Norway in a few months. I'm still looking at the chat window. I don't see any other questions. So I'll look back to, let's see here. Do you use video as a way to see how things can be done differently? That's a great question. I am a very, very big believer in looking at video. Often in the middle of a training session, it can be hard to see what goes well and what goes wrong. Often I find for myself as a trainer, one of the best evaluation tools available to me is to look at video. And when people ask questions like, should I use an end of session signal or not? I often like to say, well, let's watch a video. Let's watch you use it. And let's see how your animals respond when you're done. And that can be a very, very effective way to make some of those decisions. Here's another question. When it comes to dogs, have you seen any difference in responses to end of session signals from different type of breeds? Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't see a big difference with different breeds. What I see is a difference based on training history. And the reason I think that that's important is oftentimes if you have a herding breed, for example, many herding dog trainers will train in a very similar way. Or if I'm working with a livestock guarding dog, they are often trained in a very specific way. And so often their response to things like an end of session signal or anything else that you use is often related to their past history with training, what they have learned previously. And so I don't tend to find that it's different by breed. I find it's different based on their learning history and the way their trainer has trained previously. That's what I think is probably the most important aspect, is understanding a little bit about their previous training experience. Excuse me. All right, great, thank you. Here's another question from Nina. When we're doing a real fun session, nose work, for example, I often throw some treats for them to search right at the end of session signal. They know that after eating those treats, there are no more training. Yeah, that's a really good example. In fact, a lot of people do that when I'm working with a large group of animals. What I often do when I am done is I may be done, but before I leave, I give them a whole bunch of treats on the floor, and then I walk away. That way, when they're finished eating those treats, they know that I'm done. But when I'm done, they're not really finished yet. They now have the opportunity to forage and look for the treats that you've put on the floor. And so I see how that could be called an end of session signal, but it is an opportunity still for the animal to be reinforced after you've ended the session. And that is what can help make that end of session cue a more positive experience. So great example, and I appreciate you sharing that. All right, it's 10:30. I think we're out of time. Gru, Anameta, anything else you want to share?
No, it's been really, really great listening to you, and a very interesting topic. And we look so forward to learning more about the other topics in October. And mentioning whale rosses, I can just mention that at the moment we have a whale ross problem in Oslo, our capital in Norway. So we have this young female Freya. She's into boats. And she will forage in Oslo harbor, and she will then jump up to rib boats and destroy them. So if she is still here in October, then maybe the Norwegian government will need you to to train her not to jump on these expensive boats.
Well, those are one of the many kinds of problems I often deal with. I deal with a lot of animals that are causing problems in the wild, and they're a part of a variety of conservation projects that I work on all the time. So if there's time when I come down to Norway, I'd love to hear about that and love to share some of the other conservation stories of training that I've done in the past.
So we are so much looking forward to that. So thank you for now.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we will follow up with the podcast. So to all of you that listen to Ken Ramirez now on the webinar, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, bye-bye then.